Welcome to MMA on the Rocks. My name is Bill Welker. You are listening to episode 186 of the podcast, or you're joining us live here on YouTube. Today is Sunday, April 19th, and we're here to recap UFC 249. And that's it. We're done. Let me introduce my co-host all the way from quarantine, New Jersey, Jeff, the Animal Wilson. Jeff, sorry, I had to do the UFC 249 recap before I even introduced you. I was just that anxious. How you feeling, my friend?
Oh, I'm great, dude. Getting some reading done, watching TV, and doing a couple of things for work, but nothing crazy. I'm not as freaked out as I originally was. I was a little worried with stores and stuff because things have gotten a little out of control. But I think that the mass hysteria has kind of calmed down a little bit, at least here in New Jersey. There are a lot of cases. Actually, Bill, my town has the second highest number of cases in the state of New Jersey. So, I'm not worried about it. I'm staying home for the most part. I am, when I do go out, I'm being careful. And other than that, dude, I'm reading for fun. I'm reading stuff that I wouldn't normally read during the school year because it's not educational. It's just stuff that has been on my list, but I just never had time to get around to it. So I'm enjoying reading again. I was gonna add something. Oh yeah, going back to UFC 249. If you've been living under a rock, you picked a terrible time to come out, man. UFC 249 was canceled due to COVID-19, the novel coronavirus. But I don't know why people have a problem saying it. It's what's going on in the world right now. I mean, you can not say it, but it's happening. So
Yeah, it is happening. So just to put a timestamp on this, in case anybody's listening to this episode years from now, there is a global pandemic going on right now that has most people in the United States quarantined, myself and Jeff included. And people are dealing with it in different ways. Some people are out protesting because they feel like their rights as Americans have been infringed upon, and other people are doing the right thing, staying home and making sure this thing gets squashed. Meanwhile, Jacksonville, Florida opened up their beaches this weekend, and like within 30 minutes, the beach was packed with people just so anxious to start spreading disease. But leave it to Florida. You know what happened, Jeff, is people started protesting in the streets in Michigan, and they're like, we're the dumbest state in the country. And Florida was like, stand aside. We have to reassert our dominance here. Nobody's gonna out Florida, Jeff.
Bill, speaking of not being cautious or anything, I don't know how this happened. I think somebody had to have gotten paid off here, but the WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment, has been labeled as an essential business. Why, I don't know. But somebody had to have gotten paid off. Vince McMahon's got loads of money. A bunch of WWE superstars have actually been let go this week. And, people are upset about it, but you can't really blame the WWE. Some people believe they're going to get hired back when everything goes back to normal. I personally, the superstars that I saw, I think there was one or two, there was actually like three that I was upset about. And this is a list of about 17 superstars so far.
Yeah, well, there's a simple explanation for that, Jeff. Linda McMahon was a big contributor to Donald Trump's presidential campaign. So that's why the WWE was deemed essential during all of this madness that's going on. It's, like anything else, it's just a big political game, and who's writing the checks and who's pulling the strings for the checks that were written. And, it's nothing new. It just happens to be a little bit more in our faces right now because there's not a whole lot else to pay attention to. But, there's dirty shit like this going on all the time, like pandemic or not. It's just like people actually have a little bit of time to pay attention right now. It is all it comes down to. So that's what it is. And I believe Vince McMahon and Donald Trump are actually good buddies.
Yeah, yeah. Donald Trump's in the Hall of Fame. He was at one of the WrestleManias. One of
Yeah.
his guys had a match against McMahon's guy, and I think the loser had their head shaved. So
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that back in the day, back in the 90s, when Donald Trump appeared in WWE a couple of times. That was, yeah, who would have ever thought that guy would go on to become president of the United States of America? Nobody would have predicted that, but here we are. It always makes me think of the Back to the Future movie
mm.
when Michael J. Fox goes back in time and Christopher Lloyd says, "If you're from the future, who's president in 1985?" And he says, "It's Ronald Reagan." And he goes, "Ronald Reagan, the actor?"
Oh man.
I always think about that when I think about the fact that Donald Trump is our president. In any case, yeah, I don't want to get too political on here, Jeff. I don't like to share my political views publicly because it's just a hot mess right now and nobody knows what the fuck they're talking about. So I leave that to the pundits and we talk about fighting things here. So circling back to UFC 249, it didn't happen, obviously. But I guess nobody told Tony Ferguson because he went out of his way to go and make weight. 155 on the nose, championship weight, baby. He was champ shit only. Tony Ferguson's not fucking around, man. I mean, you know, Khabib has missed weight when there's actually fights that are going to happen, and Tony's out here getting on the scale when there's nothing going on. I mean, I guess he had nothing better to do, but it was
other than make weight.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Let me just cut weight. I'm bored. I already binged through Tiger King and there's nothing else on Amazon Prime. Let me cut weight. But I don't think Tony cuts a whole lot to get to 155. I don't think it's like a huge drop for him. He fights pretty close to his natural weight, but yeah, I mean, it was one of the only MMA headlines of the week, you know, aside from UFC 249 being canceled. So I don't know. What do you think about that, Jeff? Does it make you think any more or less with Tony Ferguson, or what did you think?
Not really. He would have made weight, regardless. And as a matter of fact, he did make weight regardless. So, he's not somebody I was worried about making weight. But Bill, now that he has made weight and UFC 249 didn't happen, it's tiramisu time, baby. That's all I
Yeah, and now they're still talking about in May. They're talking about Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje, and I don't know if Russia's still on lockdown or if Khabib was just being difficult during all this, but it seems like they're just trying to cut him out of the picture. Any thoughts on that?
Nah, I mean, we don't know how long this thing's gonna go on for, Bill. So the UFC to say that they have a date secured, I think, is a little preemptive. It's not helpful right now. Like in New Jersey, this whole quarantine thing has been extended to May 15th. I was just reading about that yesterday. So, I think it's a little too early to be calling the shots here. I think that the UFC, like the whole entire world right now, is a beggar trying to choose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess they're just trying to stay positive and try and push this thing along and get business up and running. I know here in Florida, we're on lockdown through the end of April as of right now. But that may change. Once they open the beaches and like if they get a couple of cases of this thing as a result of that, I have a feeling we could be locked down a little longer. I know schools are closed through the end of the year here. I imagine a lot of the country will follow suit on that, which is going to make it tough to open up everything else because how's everybody going to go back to work, while their kids are home and they need to be homeschooled? Some people can work from home, but then when you start combining childcare with working from home, that's a recipe for disaster. So I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what's going to go on. I do know that, we'll keep doing our part, which by the way, Jeff, my company, which I never talk about on this show. I never mention, what I do outside of MMA, but we have started producing some ventilator masks for people. and those are available on our website, marcellagifts.com. We've been donating them about 3-1. So for every one we sell, we donate 3. There's no formula or anything. That's just the way it's been working out. We've been trying to get them to hospitals and people who need the masks, but I just figured I'd throw that out there if anybody is in need. It's not something we're really promoting or anything, but if you know people who are having a hard time getting hold of masks, we had the materials and we wanted to keep paying our employees. So they've been working from home. We got them sewing machines to make the masks at home, and I go and drop off the materials for them, and they've just been cranking them out. They've been doing a great job. So just figure I'd throw that out there. So again, that's marcellagifts.com. If you guys need to get a hold of some masks, and I'll put a link up on the social media as well. And that's about as much of my professional life as you're going to get out of me on this show, Jeff.
Yeah, that's totally fair, dude. And speaking of professional life, I hope America, I hope you appreciate teachers a little bit more now. All right, because now you know what it feels like to have to deal with your kid every day. That kid, and you know what, Bill? I'm going on a rant here. That kid, and present company excluded, but that kid that's not getting raised, and who's not being taught manners and respect, and to not speak when somebody else is speaking, stuff like that. But I gotta also kind of compartmentalize here. I know that's not everybody, and I kind of feel for the parents who, like you said, Bill, have to balance out childcare with, working. And for those parents who are essential workers and are probably having a hard time finding childcare, those parents who probably have like 3 jobs because it's just one parent in the household, I feel for them too, Bill. But for those of you who have 2 parents at home and you don't have time to raise your kid, I don't know what you're doing. And Bill, of course, present company excluded. I know you guys take turns, and it's tough. I mean, I'm lucky I don't have kids. I don't want kids, mostly because of teaching. I think it's the ultimate contraceptive is being a teacher. And see, Bill, you're out of the game. That's why you wanted to have a kid.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It stopped me from having a kid for the 7 years that I was in the school system. You're absolutely right about that, because the last thing you want to see at the end of a day of teaching is a kid. So I'm totally with you on that. And even myself with my toddler, it's been, I don't want to say it's been a struggle. Like it's nice that I'm afforded the opportunity to stay home with her every day, but man, that daycare is so clutch, man. Like I've watched Frozen and Monsters Incorporated so many times since this quarantine has started, and the song, like, we try not to give her too much screen time, but she still loves the music, like the soundtracks from Frozen and Frozen 2. It's been nonstop, man. We've been doing the homeschooling, like we do her letters and numbers and colors and everything like that. But yeah, man, those Frozen songs, they're in here, man. It's like
they're on an infinite loop.
Yeah, it's been nonstop. And I've tried to even introduce, like, we got the Disney Plus, and I try to introduce her to some other movies, and it's always no. She wants Monsters, and Frozen, and she'll watch both of the Frozen movies and both of the Monsters movies, which at least mixes it up a little bit. And I don't mean to get political on here, Jeff, but I think Monsters University is a better movie than Monsters Inc., and that's the sequel. So,
I've never watched the sequel.
It's pretty good. I gotta say, I've watched it 500 times. This is like the story of how Billy Crystal and John Goodman's characters meet in college.
Okay.
And they get like hazed in a fraternity, and they almost get kicked out of school, and they have to join like this scaring competition. I'm building it up to be way better than it is, because it's still just a kid's movie. But I gotta say, Jeff, I'm proud of my daughter that she's so into like monsters and scary stuff, because like most kids wouldn't wouldn't be interested in that. And I'm a big
Yeah.
horror movie guy myself, so this is a good first step.
Yeah. I can't wait till she's old enough where you can show her some slasher films. Going to Jason, Freddy.
I tried. She's she's not ready.
Bill, she's 2.
Oh,
man.
is that too young? I must have skipped that chapter of the manual. Anyway, Jeff, we're talking about championship weight before. So you and I were kind of brainstorming ideas to talk about here on the show, which we never do. We usually just, click and rip,
Yeah.
as they say, and we talk about whatever's going on. We actually did some work to find something to talk about today. And it's a show that we've been talking about for years, and an idea we've been talking about for years. And I had a harder time than I thought putting my list together. And the list that we both put together was our top 5 favorite fighters who have fought in the UFC and never won a UFC championship. That includes an interim championship. They may have been champions in other organizations, but never got their hands on the UFC strap. So we both put together our top 5, and we'll kind of bounce back and forth. And you guys have kind of gotten the gist of how we do this format here. Hopefully we'll get a little bit of MMA nostalgia. We'll give you guys some ideas for some old fights to go back and watch while you're stuck in quarantine. And of course, give you a little bit of content here while you are stuck at home, assuming you are, or if you're an essential worker and you're listening to us at work. We definitely appreciate everything you're doing out there. So you want to kick it off, Jeff? Give me your. I have mine in kind of an order, but it's loose, and I also have a bunch of honorable mentions. I know you do too, but get us started here, kid.
All right, Bill. This is a fighter that we can never agree on, even though he beat John Jones and should have won the light heavyweight championship. The first fighter on my list, Bill, one of my personal favorites,
Jeff,
Alexander.
Matt Hamill never fought John Jones for the title.
Talking about Alexander Gustafsson, Bill, who is the rightful heir to the light heavyweight championship because he beat John Jones the first time. The second time, I can't dispute that. He got knocked out. He started crying. But who hasn't cried fighting against John Jones? DC cried.
I believe he got submitted in that second fight.
Was there a submission? Might have been. I can't remember. But go back and watch that one. Both fights. They were both really good. I felt like Gustafsson just, in a different time, man. Like any time where John Jones was not in the UFC, I think Gustafsson is a shoo-in for the light heavyweight championship. Really good boxing, really clean striking, and fast hands, great footwork. And Bill, the reason I'm such a big Gustafsson fan is because his first loss in the UFC was to Phil Davis. It was a submission. I believe it was an anaconda choke. That was a good fight too. Go back and watch that one.
You were right, Jeff. It was a knockout in that second fight.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I couldn't remember because it just all happened so fast. But so his first loss in the UFC for Gustafsson was against Phil Davis. And, Gustafsson had enough wherewithal, had enough fighter intelligence to realize, something in my game is not working. Something's lacking. So what does he do? He starts training with Phil Davis. He becomes a really, I don't want to say good because I can't really compare him to anybody, but he does improve his wrestling by a lot at this point. And this is leading up to the first fight against John Jones. And he took down John Jones a couple of times in their fight. Stuffed a couple of Jones takedowns, who, I think we can all agree is the better wrestler in that equation. So for me, seeing Gustafsson being so willing and so in love with the game to improve his own, for me, that's always stuck out to me. I've always loved fighters who can kind of reinvent themselves and add to their game and not just stick to one dimension of it, or, not stick to just what brought them to the dance, as the saying goes. So yeah, Bill, for me, my first pick is Alexander Gustafsson. Some great wins in the UFC. A lot of really enjoyable fights from Gustafsson. So who's your first pick, Bill?
Well, none of those wins in the UFC were against John Jones, as the record shows. But he does have a win over Matt Hamill, who is the only person who on paper has a win over John Jones.
Yeah, but
So
I mean, if you haven't, okay, Bill, I'm going to address this. If you have, for those of you listening, if you've never seen John Jones versus Matt Hamill, go back and watch it because clearly John Jones won that fight. He should not have been disqualified. He dislocated Hamill's shoulder from the sheer beating that he gave him. But Gustafsson should have beaten John Jones,
but he didn't. So I'm going. My number 5 is a purely emotional pick. It's not anybody who's ever particularly close to winning a UFC title, but it's Joe Lozon. I would have always liked to see him get that opportunity just because he's one of my favorite fighters to watch. The guy has never been in a boring fight. Both of his wars with Jim Miller are both classics. Some of my favorite fights to watch ever, and go back and watch the replays there and some controversial decisions as well. Always, he's always been a fighter to just put everything on the line, and he's always shot from the hip. I remember he beat oh gosh, the guy's name is escaping me right now. The Polish guy. Marcin Held. He beat him, won a decision, and when he was interviewed, he was like, "I didn't win that fight. The judges got it wrong." And I've never heard that from any other fighter before or since. Just that realness that Joe Lozon brings to the octagon. I don't feel like too many people have ever done that. And I've always appreciated that about him. I've always wanted to see him succeed. And a little caveat to this too, because I had some other people I was toying with the idea of putting on this list, but I still feel like they maybe have a chance to still win a championship. So I didn't want to include them. That's why Joe Lozon makes the list for me. And just, one of my favorite fighters of all time knocked out another one of my favorite fighters, Jens Pulver, who I was talking about last week, knocked him out before he even got into the UFC, or before he even got on the Ultimate Fighter. Had a knockout win over Jens Pulver going into the Ultimate Fighter show. Nate Diaz would ultimately win that season, but it was one of the earlier seasons. I want to say 4 or 5. But yeah, for a lot of people who are newer to the sport, you may not be familiar with Joe Lozon. But if you're a fan of this show and you kind of trust that I know what I'm talking about, go and look up some Joe Lozon fights and you won't be disappointed. Win or lose, that guy always put on a show. And I would have loved to see him get the opportunity to fight for a championship. And I don't think we're going to see that. And I don't think he cares either. I think he just loves the sport and loves competing. And he's just that kind of guy, man. One of the realest dudes to ever put on the gloves and get in there. What do you got next, Jeff?
So, Bill, this might be on your list too, but I'm going to take a chance. For me, another fighter who I would have loved to see as a champion was Chael Sonnen, dude. Just because, his first fight with Anderson Silva, absolutely legendary. We've talked about that a couple of times. That was on one of my personal favorite fights of all time. And, Chael Sonnen, he could do everything, man. He could wrestle. He was, good with his hands, and he could talk too. That came a little bit later in his career, but super entertaining, especially even after the UFC, man. If you go watch his interviews building up to the Tito Ortiz fight in the UFC, man, he tore Tito Ortiz apart, man. And he was just so funny about it. And at the end of the day, when Chael retired, he was very humble about it. He said he was, his biggest disappointment is probably not winning a belt, just because he promised his dad that he would, before his dad passed away. So seeing that side of Chael Sonnen was also really interesting, because at the end of the day, these fighters, they build characters for themselves, but at the end of the day, they're also human. So seeing Chael never be able to win a championship in the UFC or Bellator. It kind of stings. I've been a big fan of his for a while. So I would have liked to see him become a champion at some point. He's a great fighter. I don't think that he got the credit he deserved just because his record was very. It was nothing impressive. It wasn't anything too standout ish.
Mhm.
I think he was like 30 something and like 19 losses. I can't remember his record exactly. Don't quote me on that. But, he had some huge wins. He beat Brian Stan, who I think Brian Stan is one tough customer, man. He's probably one of my honorable mentions too, Brian Stan. But, yeah, man, for me, Chael Sonnen, dude, without a doubt, I would have loved to see him as a champion.
Yeah. Well, you guessed right. Chael was number 3 on my list, Jeff. So I guess I'll just talk about it here, and I'll add a couple of points to what you were talking about. Yeah, never won a championship in any organization, and promised his dad, even on his deathbed, that he would win an MMA championship. In my book, he goes down as a champion because when he was in the WEC, he fought Paulo Filho. And Paulo Filho was the champ at the time, and he did not make weight. Chael Sonnen did make weight, went out and won the fight, and didn't win the title. Which, if that were to happen in the UFC, it wouldn't count as a title defense if Filho would have won, but it would count for Sonnen to win the belt if he won, because he did the right thing. He made weight, and he won a fight. And he would be totally justified in feeling that way too, that he was the champion because he beat the champion, but because the organization didn't see it the same way, and Chael is just like a stand-up dude, despite the character that he played in the latter part of his career. He really is just a stand-up dude, and he's very by the book, and a very underrated fighter, as you were saying. Very underrated boxing. The way he mixed his wrestling in was really a thing of beauty. The performance he put on against Anderson Silva in the first fight, he was a couple of minutes away from being a world champion. That fight dominated Anderson Silva, one of the greatest to ever do it. And then he'd had a couple of more opportunities, stepped up last minute to get in there with John Jones. I was there live for that fight in the Prudential Center in New Jersey, and Jones was way too much for him, especially moving up in weight and everything. But John Jones did break his toe in that first round, and the referees, I guess, missed it or whatever, and Jones had to put him away. It was like do or die, and if he didn't, maybe Chael would have gotten that fluke DQ win or injury TKO over John Jones, and that would have totally rewritten history. But yeah, Chael Sonnen is up there on my list because I just always feel like he's been underappreciated as a fighter because people focus so much on the character he played and the shit he talked, and he was one of the first to really bring that kind of WWE marketing mentality over to MMA, and he was very successful with it. He still is, as a broadcaster, because he still kind of plays that character, and that's his bread and butter. But yeah, so I skipped one on my list, but I'll just flip 3 and 4. The order doesn't really matter, Jeff. And so yeah, Chael Sonnen, and I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, so this is somebody who could potentially win the belt in the future, but because of the weight class that they're in, he's a flyweight. That's kind of uncertain because I don't see Cejudo going back down to flyweight. And this might change, but for me, Joseph Benavidez is on my list, Bill. Joseph Benavidez. Oh man, I hear the pen clicking. Was that on your list too?
No, I'm just keeping track of what your picks are.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so Joseph Benavidez, man. I think Team Alpha Male have such a great team, Bill. And, there's another Team Alpha Male person on my list as well. But, they just, I don't know how to put this. Like, they run into these one or two guys, like a Dominic Cruz or a Mighty Mouse Johnson, where they're so invincible in their time. that I think that Team Alpha Male just can't catch a break, man. Between Uriah Faber, Chad Mendes, a couple of other guys, but between Team Alpha Male guys, they probably had like 8 to 10 title shots in a span of like 4 or 5 years, and the only person to win the belt was TJ. Only people to win the belt were TJ Dillashaw and Cody Garbrandt. So, statistically speaking, Team Alpha Male haven't done well, but they've always been at that upper echelon of fighters. And for me, Joseph Benavidez, man, he ran into Mighty Mouse Johnson. No, only one person beat him, and that was Henry Cejudo. And then he ran into Figueiredo, and I felt like that was his last shot. He's had this. This is his third shot at the belt here. Lost to Mighty Mouse twice. Lost to Figueiredo, and it was just, man, it was so disappointing because he did everything right. He made the weight, but Figueiredo was just too much for him. Somebody who'd been tearing through the division, and Figueiredo didn't even make weight, so now there's not even a flyweight champion at this point. But yeah, for me, Joseph Benavidez, man, he's a journeyman. I feel like he's somebody who I would love to see as a flyweight champion, and I just don't think that's going to happen after the way Figueiredo starched him. And building up to that point in the fight, I remember it clear as day. Benavidez was not doing too much effectively. He was just eating counter shots, and Figueiredo just demonstrating his stay power, where he could just stand in the middle of the octagon and just kind of hit Benavidez from wherever Benavidez was. So really, really, I think he's just had some tough breaks, but I think he's such a great fighter, Bill. He's really up there, especially in the flyweight division. I think he's one of the more exciting fighters in a division that, like we've spoken about a lot, Bill, has been cleaned out by Mighty Mouse. And I've always felt like Benavidez was, when I heard Benavidez's name, I was like, all right, that fight I'm definitely tuning in for.
Yeah. Sorry, I think we froze for a quick second here. Yeah, that's definitely a great pick. Yeah, Joseph Benavidez is just one of those guys throughout his career, wrong place at the wrong time, and like you said, there was just that the one guy like he couldn't beat. And I think there's been a bunch of those guys throughout history, and that's just the way it goes, man. Maybe in like a different generation, you could have been the best in the world, but because somebody else existed at the same time, at the same weight class, it just wasn't in the cards for you. And that kind of leads me to, I'm going to backtrack to my number 4 pick, since I already talked about Chael Sonnen, and it's also happens to be one of my favorite analysts right now, and that's Kenny Florian.
Good pick.
Thank you. And yeah, Kenny is just, I think, just a guy who got in it so early, and he was a guy who was in the right place at the right time, very often. When he got onto The Ultimate Fighter back in 2004 or 2005, whatever it was, the first season of The Ultimate Fighter, Dana White was going to a show to look at another fighter to audition for the show. And he saw Kenny Florian, and he's like, that guy is tough as shit, and put him on the show. Kenny Florian competed on that show and went to the finale at 185 pounds.
Sheesh.
Now, keep in mind, Kenny Florian is a guy who later in his career finished his career fighting at 145 pounds. So at that time, he was fighting like above his walk-around weight. Got in there with Diego Sanchez in the finale and, got TKO'd in the first round, but then would go on to have this great career where pretty much his only losses were in title fights. He fought Sean Sherk for the title in 2006, and gave Sean Sherk a run for his money. Sean Sherk was a fucking beast at the time, as the lightweight champion. Cut him open bad. He had those nasty elbows, those Florian elbows. He was like the Tony Ferguson of his generation. And then he would go on to fight BJ Penn at UFC 101. and he was doing really well against BJ Penn in that fight. Like, he had the game plan to beat him. And then I guess it just kind of fell apart for him. I don't know if it was a mental struggle or whatever it was, but Kenny Florian was one of those guys who could perform at the peak every single time, except when he was fighting for a title. And then the only non-title fight loss he had was against Cray Maynard. And then in his last fight, he fought Jose Aldo for that featherweight title and came up short in a decision loss. But Kenny Florian, so 3 title fights throughout his career, came up short every time. But I also feel like because he got in the game so early, he spent so much time like trying to figure out the right things to do. You know, like if he had gotten into it now and you use his skill set and, you know, proper nutrition and weight cutting and everything like that, and he could have done his whole career at 145, I think it would have been a different story. But maybe not, because, you know, maybe he still would have run into a Jose Aldo or a Max Holloway and that guy that he just couldn't have beaten. But I was always a fan of Kenny Florian. You know, same as Joe Lozon. In fact, he fought Joe Lozon in 2008 and finished him. TKO'd him. Always went out there to finish fights. That famous Kenny Florian post-fight speech where he's like, I finish fights. And it happens to be the intro to his podcast, the Anakin Florian podcast, which I really only listen up through Ray Longo's bit on that podcast. I turn it off after that. But Kenny Florian, to this day, one of my favorite analysts. Just the way he breaks down the sport is just amazing, and his skill set was top notch. Man, he was a black belt in jiu-jitsu. Well, he still is a black belt in jiu-jitsu, and he had that Mark Delagrati Thai boxing behind him. So he really developed some nasty striking, the elbows, cutting people open later in his career. And he's just always been high up there on my list as guys that, you know, I would have liked to see him achieve that championship, but it just wasn't in the cards for his career. But I'll always remember him as one of the best ever.
Yeah, dude, that's a great pick, man. Kenny Florian, dude, another guy who's in the upper echelon of UFC fighters. And, you know, Bill, those guys that you mentioned, they were all legends, man. And you know, Ken Flo himself is a legend, but those guys in their day were unstoppable. Jose Aldo, BJ Penn in his prime, and Sean, the Muscle Shark Sherk. Oh, man, dude, like, dude, just hearing his name, like, I get goosebumps because, you know, Sean Sherk was an animal.
Yeah.
You know, it seemed, yeah, it was a muscle shark. I didn't even know that was a thing, you know, but
it was a thing. His name was Sean Sherk.
Yeah, dude. Man, Sean Sherk in the lightweight division, that brings back some good memories. I wasn't a fan of the UFC at the time, but I've gone back and watched some of his fights, and he was just tearing that division apart, man. Yeah, dude. So some tough luck for Ken Flo there. You know, and especially if you're more of a newer UFC fan and you probably have seen Kenny Florian doing commentary for Fighting Robots, you know, before that, he was, you know, very talented fighter, especially, you know, he fought in like 4 weight classes, I think, you know. Yeah. So you know, you don't hear about that anymore. Same with BJ Penn. He fought in like a couple weight classes too. I remember when he fought Lyoto Machida at like light heavyweight. Yeah. That was insane. But anyway, my next pick is a female fighter who I think, man, I think life kind of got in her way. For me, it's Kat Zingano. Bill, I'm always going to talk about her. The last person to beat Amanda Nunes. You know, she had a title shot, Kat Zingano, against Ronda Rousey, and she kind of just, I don't know if it was, you know, too many lights, but she, you know, she ran up to Ronda Rousey with a flying knee, just, you know, left her feet, and Ronda caught her in an armbar as you know, this was Ronda when she was beating people in like 35 seconds. And, you know, Kat Zingano said in the post-fight interview, you know, I messed up. And she kind of knew she jumped the gun a little bit, but for me, Kat Zingano's thing has just been, she's an awesome fighter, but her real life problems, just it's stuff that no person going through that would, fighting was probably the last thing on her mind. Her husband passed away, so it's just her raising her son. I think she tore her ACL or something, just a bunch of stuff. And just, another fighter who, again, just tough breaks, bad luck. And I think that's kind of the kind of recurring theme in our lists here, Bill. All these fighters they were great fighters. They are great fighters, but just, one or two things, that they just, couldn't get around. So for me, Kat Zingano, really tough chick, man. Just her wrestling is great. She was really developing her striking and just able to mix it all together. And dude, I always think back to that Amanda Nunes fight, because that fight was right after her husband passed away. And, Kat Zingano was losing that fight. She was getting picked apart in the first 2 rounds. And in the third round, Bill, she, Amanda Nunes was on top, and Kat Zingano, just, there was something inside of her that wouldn't give up, Bill. And she was able to reverse the position, get on top of Nunes and just pounded her out and just made Nunes quit. The way that she won, it was just so fascinating to me, being able to have that mindset to, not surrender and make Nunes kind of just conk out here, for lack of a better term. For me, Zingano, she's one of my favorite fighters, and, I hope to see her back someday, but I don't think that's going to happen. She's up there in years. I know she wants to raise her son, so, might not happen.
Yeah, that's a great pick. And I think a lot of people don't understand, especially newer UFC fans who see Ronda Rousey with this WWE persona. Maybe they started watching like right around the time she got knocked out by Holly Holm and knocked out by Amanda Nunes, but she was the Mike Tyson of women's MMA, where girls were already beaten before they even got in the cage with her, because of what she was doing to people, arm barring them in 40 seconds and everything like that. And it was a lot of mental, and it all went away when she got knocked out by Holly Holm. And I think a lot of people really forget that. When Holly Holm came in and played Buster Douglas to Ronda Rousey's Mike Tyson. And it's another one of those things. If Ronda Rousey doesn't exist, you could go in a lot of different philosophical directions with this. Like, does women's MMA even survive if Ronda Rousey doesn't exist? But if she doesn't, does Kat Zingano go on to be the greatest, women's MMA fighter of all time, or do her personal issues get in the way? Or I remember Kat Zingano beating the fuck out of Miesha Tate, who in my book is one of the greatest of all time. Pound for pound, one of the hottest fighters to ever do it.
Amen to that.
So a good pick there. My number 2, I switched at the last second. I had somebody else and I moved them to my honorable mentions, and I went with Nick Diaz. And this was a tough one for me because Nick has had such a strange career, but at the end of the day, he got in there with some of the best ever. He was in there with George St. Pierre, went the distance. He was in there with Anderson Silva, went the distance. Lost a close decision in a fight where not a whole lot happened, and then it got overturned because Anderson Silva, not only was he in there with Anderson Silva, he was in there with Anderson Silva on steroids. So, that fact alone, he was able to go the distance with a guy who tested positive for steroids and was killing everybody. Granted, this was after Anderson Silva broke his leg. Maybe it wasn't the same Anderson, but it was still Anderson. It was a juiced up Anderson, and Nick Diaz got in there with him. Strikeforce welterweight champion, WEC welterweight champion, was just never able to quite get there in the UFC. And I say Nick over Nate because I feel like Nick had more of a championship resume. And just the fact that he got fucked over so many times, a 5-year suspension for marijuana, and all the dumb shit, all the hoops they made him jump through, getting his Gogo Plata submission of Takanori Gomi overturned because of weed. One of the most spectacular submissions of all time in a great fight. That was a fantastic fight over in Japan. So if you guys have never seen that, definitely go back and watch Nick Diaz versus Takanori Gomi. Another guy who fought in multiple weight classes. His last fight of his career was against Anderson Silva at 185. He was a welterweight champion, Strikeforce and WEC, like I said. Fought George St. Pierre at welterweight, went to distance with him. Had a win over, his last win was over BJ Penn. And that was in 2011. So arguably a still dangerous BJ Penn. Not like a BJ Penn today, Jeff, where like, a bouncer from a strip club could get in there with him. So I was on the fence about including Nick Diaz just because he had so much weird shit going on in his career. But I feel like at the end of the day, his resume is deserving of a UFC championship, and it was just never realized. So I wanted to throw him back in there. By the way, the person I took off my list to substitute with Nick Diaz was Wanderlei Silva. So I'll put him as a honorable mention because Wanderlei Silva, and there's a big asterisk next to Wanderlei Silva because when he was axe murdering people in Pride, he was so high on cocaine and steroids. And granted, everybody was, that's just not going to transition to the UFC. And like when we finally got his matchup with Chuck Liddell that was built up for years and years, those of you who have been MMA fans for a long time, how long we wanted to see Wanderlei and Chuck, and it got built up so much, and we finally got to see it. It was a fucking dud. It was one of the bigger disappointments ever. We wanted to see them when Wanderlei was in Pride and all coked up and like just ready to murder people, fighting 16 times in a night and then fighting people backstage. But when I really started to think about it, like, was his behavior really like championship? Like, is that the guy you want to see as the champion of the world? Like, no, it's a coked up animal who used to get in there and fucking murder people, and it was entertaining to watch, but I wouldn't want to put any accolades to what he did. But by far, probably one of the scariest dudes. We were making a top 5 scariest dudes ever. Wanderlei in Pride has to be on it. And I had the opportunity to meet him at Bare Knuckle Boxing a couple months ago, and he was an awesome dude. He's really good to me and really cool guy, and probably going to end up doing Bare Knuckle Boxing. But in any case, Nick Diaz was my pick. So let's hear it, Jeff. Who's the number one?
Oh man, Bill, I'm scared to say because I think he might be on your list too. So Bill, hold on, how do I put this? I'll give you the name. If it's not on your list, I'll talk about him. But if he is on your list, I'll let you talk about him because I couldn't do him justice if he's on your list.
I have a feeling I know who you picked. Can I guess?
Yes.
Is it Uriah Faber?
No. It's Dan Henderson.
Oh yeah, he's my number one too.
All right, so I'll leave that one to you. But for me, it is another member of Team Alpha Male. It's actually and Uriah Faber is honorable mention on here just because he's had so many title shots and he's never dropped lower than like number 2 in the rankings. But for me, it's Chad Mendes, another Team Alpha Male member, and dude, Chad Mendes, he's a monster, man. And he got screwed over a little bit after that like 2-year suspension for whatever it is that was in his system. And if USADA has proven nothing, it's that sometimes the tests are a little too good. I felt, and I'm with you on the Nick Diaz comments as well. Nick Diaz, he really got screwed over by the commission, man. A 5-year suspension over something, rather minuscule, maybe a year and a half tops, I think would have been fair. But 5 years is excessive, man, especially when you look at guys like John Jones, who, has and I don't want to get too much into this, but numerous offenses kind of stacked on top of each other, and I think the highest suspension he got was like 2 years or like a year and 6 months or something. But anyway,
dude, he got more slaps on the wrist than a third grade classroom in the 90s when slap bracelets were in fashion.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, so for me, I feel like Nick Diaz really kind of got shafted, and that Takanori Gomi fight is one of my favorites, dude. The first time I saw that fight, the next day I was trying to hit Gogo Platas on people. I managed to get one, so it was a really fun day. But but yeah, dude.
Did you really?
Yeah. It was. I mean, I don't really count it because it was like a newer person, and I was kind of being a dick. But I mean, it was cool to like. And then I tried it again against someone more experienced, and they just stood right up because I didn't. I missed part of the move, but yeah, anyway, I digress. So for me, Chad Mendes, really good fighter, especially towards the latter half of his career, where he added striking to his game. And this is like before he got knocked out by Frankie Edgar. He was tearing up the 145-pound division. Unfortunately, same problem that some of the other guys on our list have run into. He ran into Jose Aldo twice. And in the second fight, he can be argued that he could have used his wrestling a little bit more effectively. But he wanted to stand up with Aldo, which I don't really blame him for. I felt like his striking had really, really grown and had become, very effective in that division. Ran into Conor McGregor, another tough customer. I'm not a big fan of Conor McGregor, but I got to give credit where it's due. He's a good fighter. And then he ran into Frankie Edgar, who, another person who is at the top, former lightweight champion. And I was actually a little shocked when Frankie knocked Chad Mendes out. I didn't think I thought Frankie could win, but I never thought it would be in that fashion. So for me, Chad Mendes, dude, he kind of reminds me of Sean Sherk in a lot of ways, just more because of how he's built physically. But yeah, Chad Mendes, dude, somebody who could probably fight at 135, but he likes to fight at 145. And dude, and especially in his later fights, just the way he became such a good striker, dude. And once what's his face? Once Dwayne Bang Ludwig showed up, I felt like everybody in Team Alpha Male, all their striking improved by miles and miles. That includes Joseph Benavidez and Uriah Faber. So for me, I don't know if we'll see Chad Mendes in there again. He got knocked out pretty bad by Frankie, and then I think he had another knockout loss after that. But yeah, dude.
He is officially retired right now.
Oh, he is? Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, dude, for me, Chad Mendes, man, like I felt like, kind of the recurring theme here. If Jose Aldo and Conor McGregor and Frankie Edgar hadn't gotten in his way, I think, history would be a little bit different.
Yeah, for sure. I would probably put Uriah Faber ahead of Chad Mendes, but it's one I didn't really think about. Just because Faber was a champion in other organizations and just was always so close. And like you said, never ranked below like number 2 and fought into his 40s and won fights in his 40s, I believe.
Yeah.
39
finished fights in his 40s.
Yeah. But yeah, man, my number 1 is Dan Henderson. And no matter how many times, if you catch me on a different day, this list will look completely different. But Dan Henderson will always be at the top, just because remembering watching him back in Pride and watching him do the things he did. He was a wrestler, Olympic caliber wrestler, competed in 2 Olympic games, finished 10th and 12th, respectively, I believe. Greco-Roman style wrestler. He did compete in freestyle a little bit, but was more known for that Greco-Roman style. But man, that fucking overhand right. When you talk about like some of the greatest singular weapons in the history of MMA, like you have to bring up the Dan Henderson right hand, man. He used to just walk out there with that thing like winding it up, like I'm gonna throw this right hand at your face.
Oh man.
And try and stop it. He did go through a period of his career where he was known as Decision Dan, and he was winning a lot of decisions. But man, when he landed that H-bomb, especially against Michael Bisping in the first fight, one of the most spectacular knockouts of all time. If we were doing our top 5 favorite knockouts, this would probably be at the top of my list as well. When he knocked out Bisping, I think, was it UFC 100?
I think I'm not 100%.
I'm pretty sure it was.
Didn't he fight Anderson Silva on that one?
Let me see. I got it here in front of me. It was UFC 100. He knocked out Michael Bisping, and then he left for a little while. He went over to Strikeforce, where he knocked out Fedor with that big right hand. At heavyweight, here's another one of these guys. Like the weight class didn't matter. Like he just wanted to fight. He was the welterweight and middleweight champion in Pride, which if you're just Googling that can be a little bit deceiving because welterweight in Pride was 185 and middleweight was 205. So anybody who sees that and thinks that Dan Henderson fought at 170 pounds, that's not correct. Pride had different weight classes. So when you see like welterweight champion of Pride, that was actually what we consider a middleweight. Had a couple of opportunities at UFC Gold, fought Anderson Silva, got submitted by him. I was really rooting for him there, but that's when Anderson Silva was basically unbeatable. And then, he had the rematch against Michael Bisping, which it seemed like it was destiny because Dan Henderson was ranked like 14th at the time. Bisping wins the title from Luke Rockhold, and he wants to avenge his loss against Dan Henderson because it was so embarrassing, highlight reel knockout. So he calls out Dan Henderson, and it seemed like destiny. Dan Henderson gets this last opportunity to come off the bench out of like semi-retirement and fight for a title. And beats the shit out of Bisping, like really busted him up good in that fight, but loses the decision. But yeah, man, one of the first double champs ever, welterweight and middleweight champ, or as we would call it, middleweight and light heavyweight champ in Pride. And then was the Strikeforce light heavyweight champion as well. So I don't know if it's just like an emotional thing or just because I watched it, I watched his wars with Vanderlei Silva. I watched like the crazy shit that he went through in his career when he beat Vitor Belfort in Pride. You could just go down the list. When he knocked out Fedor, his epic fight with Mauricio Shogun Rua at UFC 139, where they both almost killed each other. That's one of the greatest fights of all time. If it's not in the Hall of Fame as a singular fight, then it should be.
The rematch was great too.
His knockout of Akira Gono in Pride. Got in there with Nogueira. Has a knockout win over Renzo Gracie. Just like an insane career. And fought well into his 40s. I think he was 46 when he retired.
Yeah.
So when I think about this topic that you and I have brought up a couple of times over the years, Jeff, like Dan Henderson is just always the one that comes to mind. Like he's the number one that should have been a UFC champion with all the skills that he had and everything that he accomplished throughout his career. Like it just should have happened and it didn't. It just never lined up. Like when he was on the top of his game, he just didn't happen to be in the UFC at the time, but very well could have been the best fighter on planet Earth in several weight classes. And just an all around tough son of a bitch, man. Came from that old Team Quest where they just used to beat the brakes off of each other every day, and that's how they practice fighting. They would just fight each other.
Yeah.
We got Chael Sonnen on both of our lists as well. So obviously that Team Quest was doing something right because they got two guys who made both of our lists. Couple of honorable mentions I had. Cowboy Cerrone was a guy that I would have liked to see him win a title. Probably got those title shots that he had, more because he was so marketable and not for his fight resume. And maybe will continue to do so. He's probably always 1 or 2 wins away from a title shot, and anything can happen. Uriah Faber is definitely up there for me.
Absolutely.
I remember him being so dominant in those lighter weight classes before they existed in the UFC. Probably should be considered a UFC champion just because he was a champ in the WEC. Before those weight classes existed in the UFC. So he was the best fighter in that weight class at the time. It just so happens that weight class didn't exist in the UFC. And then, by the time they did adopt it and by the WEC, Faber was a little past his prime. And another one, Jeff, that somebody I thought about, but I didn't include him on the list because I feel like there's still time. But when I put this question out on Twitter, this name came up a lot too, and that's Gilbert Burns, who I always talk about. I was glad to see that name pop up because I always talk about as one of the most underrated names in combat sports. And another one of these guys who kind of fits the theme of everything we've been talking about. He'll fight any weight class. He'll fight last minute. He'll get in there with anybody. Grappling, MMA, boxing, like you name the rule set and Gilbert Burns will show up. So yeah, hopefully, there is a championship in the future of Gilbert Burns. And then another name that came up a bunch on Twitter was Gilbert Melendez. So I thought that was another good choice. Gilbert, was a legend and just another one of those guys who there was just always somebody a little bit better.
Yeah, I was thinking of Gilbert Melendez too, and Jake Shield as well is probably on my honorable mention list. But I didn't go with them just because they were champions in other organizations. Whereas a couple of my picks, they didn't, they weren't in Strikeforce or they didn't fight in the WEC days. Yeah. But Gilbert Melendez is a good pick, man. He was tearing up the 155-pound division up until, Strikeforce got bought out by the UFC, and then they were kind of doing their Strikeforce champions versus the UFC champions, which I thought was awesome. We saw Gegard Mousasi in there. Who for me, Gegard Mousasi is probably on my honorable mention list too. He's an awesome fighter, but he ran into Uriah Hall a couple of times. Yeah, dude. And it's funny, because some of the guys that probably would have been on my list weren't, just because later on in their careers they won championships. Like Michael Bisping definitely would have been on my list if he hadn't won against Luke Rockhold. Somebody else who's on my honorable mention list. I have a lot of similar names that you do with Gilbert Melendez and Uriah Faber. But for me, Dan Hardy, man. Dan Hardy was a tough dude, and up until he ran into George St. Pierre, he was tearing up that welterweight division. But, GSP and Anderson Silva, they were beating everybody in their time. So, can't really – it's like that X factor.
Yeah, for sure. I had a lot of guys who, for whatever reason, when they came over from Pride, They were killing people over there, and then like you could say it was adjusting to the cage, you could say it was the drug testing, whatever, but they just they were killers over there, but then they came to the UFC and like just weren't as good, and you don't really know what to attribute that to. Mirko Cro Cop comes to mind. We thought this guy was going to come over and murder everybody.
Yeah.
Shogun Rua is another one who he did win a championship until he ran into a guy called John Jones. But still, if you knew the Shogun from Pride, you would think the Shogun that came to the UFC was a softie. And the Shogun in UFC was a fucking murderer. But the Shogun in Pride, that dude was a fucking serial killer.
Yeah, dude. I kind of, and I don't know if this is a factor, but like a lot of those guys that you mentioned, Bill, they spent a lot of time in Pride. I'd say that they spent the prime of their careers in Pride. So when they came over to the UFC, they were kind of on like the wrong end of their career. Because I thought Shogun Rua maybe one of the exceptions because he was kind of a little younger coming into the UFC, but I don't know. You can't discredit Shogun Rua just because he was in this like light heavyweight. How do I explain this? It was kind of like a ring toss, man. Like hot potato with the light heavyweight championship up until John Jones came along, where first it was like Forrest Griffin, and then it was, who was it? Was it Rampage who beat him? No, maybe it might have been Rashad Evans or Shogun. But like there was a couple years where like only one person, like they would win the belt and then they would lose it in their next fight. Yeah. So it was a really weird time for the light heavyweight division. Really exciting time though. You had like 5 champions in the span of like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, after Chuck Liddell lost the title,
yeah,
it kind of changed hands a bunch of times until John Jones came along. And then if John Jones didn't have his personal issues, who knows the people, like we might have been talking about Daniel Cormier on this list right now. If Jones never fucked up his life and Cormier didn't have the opportunity to come in and win that title and then go on to win the heavyweight title, he probably wouldn't have gotten the opportunity to go win that heavyweight title if he didn't win the light heavyweight championship. If John Jones didn't stand aside, unwillingly. So yeah, there's a lot of different directions we could have taken this, and I'm going to throw one more curveball at you, Jeff, just to tie things up here. I read a recent article. It was an interview with Anderson Silva where he talked about how he was ready to retire before he fought Chris Weidman for the first time. And Dana and Lorenzo bought him a Bentley, like $174,000 Bentley. And he took it. They didn't say it explicitly, but he took it as they wanted him to keep fighting. So he took that fight against Chris Weidman, the first one where he got knocked out. And he told his wife before that fight happened, if I win, I'm done. I'm going to retire. So here's my question, Jeff. If Anderson Silva retires in 2012 before fighting Chris Weidman, does he go down as the greatest of all time?
I mean, I think he goes down as the greatest of all time now. You have to take in a full body of work here because there was a lot of rich history that maybe newer fans don't remember. And when I say newer fans, I mean like after 2015. Because up until that loss, Bill, he was tearing up that entire division. He had cleaned up that division. I honestly thought that Chris Weidman was a sacrificial lamb going into that fight.
A lot of people did.
Yeah, and then, dude, I remember doing so much research the day after because, one, I couldn't believe it, and two, there were conspiracy theories. People thought that Anderson Silva had sold the belt to Weidman's team. So I'll be honest with you, Bill, I don't think that this changes anything for Anderson Silva's legacy. I think that that was a time, and I try to take the history of MMA in like eras. So that was kind of the end of Anderson Silva's era. but you also saw a lot of champions at the time losing their belts. It was kind of a passing of the guard, and that was starting with Chris Weidman. It started a period of time where there were like only one or two Brazilian champions, and I'm speaking more to the fans here because Bill, you know more about this than I do, but there was a time where like the only Brazilian champion was Jose Aldo, whereas before that it was Anderson Silva. You had some Brazilian female fighters as champions as well, and that kind of started this shift in MMA where a lot of the champions were Brazilians, but I guess MMA in the United States kind of caught up in terms of grappling and everything because a lot of the Brazilian fighters were pretty effective at grappling, and the United States kind of just caught up in the MMA game and mixing everything together. So there was a real changing of the guard during that time period. When Anderson Silva lost the belt. It wasn't just him. It was a couple of champions. Like GSP stopped fighting a little bit after that. So really, really interesting time if you look at the UFC as a whole. So that's why I don't really know how to answer your question. But I guess the short answer is no, because I think he's already one of the greatest of all time.
Yeah, for sure. I'd say definitely top 5. John Jones, GSP, Henderson, Silva, I think have to be in anybody's top 5. A lot of people would probably include Mighty Mouse in there as well. And then however you round out that top 5 is kind of up to you. Fedor comes to mind when you think of the greatest ever. Yeah, but I thought it was interesting when I read that because it's like he kind of had it in his head that he wanted to retire. He wanted to spend time with his family. And then, once somebody starts to think that way, they're not really going to perform at their peak. So did he fight Chris Weidman because he still had something to prove for his legacy? Or did he fight Chris Weidman because somebody bought him a Bentley and made him feel guilty?
Bill, I'll fight whoever you want for a Bentley, man.
I know you will, Jeff. That's why I keep you around. I'm still working towards that Bentley, but maybe a Hot Wheels. Send you a Hot Wheels Bentley. Yeah, man. All right, so we hit well over an hour, which was surprising to me. Still trying to give people content during this thing. Trying to be a little bit consistent in a world that has very little consistency right now. So I hope everybody is staying safe, doing whatever they have to provide for their families and keep their families safe. And, it's wild times out there. And, we're here to distract you for an hour a week and a little more if you need it. You can reach out to us on social media if you need to talk about anything, especially booze and fighting. It happens to be what we like talking about the most. So hit us up. You can reach Jeff at @animal_Wilson on Twitter and Instagram. And you can reach me at MMA on the Rocks everywhere on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can send me an email, MMAonTheRocks@gmail.com. And that's it. Let us know what you guys are thinking and drinking out there while you're all quarantined and waiting for the world to come back to normal, whatever that means. All right. Until next time. Cheers, everybody. Goodbye.